Welcome to the Walled Garden Podcast. Here, we nourish the gardens of our minds, one meaningful conversation at a time. If you'd like to find out more, go to thewalledgarden.com. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Walled Garden Podcast. So in the Walled Garden, we recently hosted a live interview and Q&A with Chris Fisher. Now, I'm sure that many of you will know Chris from his work on the Stoicism on Fire podcast. And on that show, and it's also a blog, the website is traditionalstoicism.com, Chris is doing amazing work, really getting the word out there about the more traditional view of Stoicism, the more traditional philosophy of Stoicism. And there's just so much beauty in that philosophy that perhaps is in our modern times missed with the more secular approaches to Stoicism, or you might say the Silicon Valley versions of Stoicism. And so this was a real honor to have Chris and particularly Kai Whiting in conversation on the podcast and spending the time trying to get to the bottom of a few very important questions about traditional Stoicism. And so at this meetup, we actually had over 20 people attend, and we had a Q&A section after the initial interview. So what you're going to hear on the podcast today is that initial interview, mostly between Kai and Chris. But if you do want to get access to the entire interview and Q&A section, which is about double the length of this episode, we really went into the weeds after the initial interview, you can actually head over and become a patron on thewalledgarden.com, and you can get access to that video on there. And so before we get into the episode, I just want to tell you a little bit more about Chris so that you know who we're dealing with here. And then I want to give you some updates for meetups coming up in the Walled Garden, and then we'll dive straight in. So Chris was first introduced to Stoic tenets while serving in the US Marine Corps. He also spent 20 years working in Silicon Valley, California, as a computer hardware specialist, software engineer, sales executive, and regional manager for a large software company. In 2004, Chris moved to Florida and returned to public service as a law enforcement officer. In preparation for his retirement from law enforcement, he relied on his lifelong passion for photography to create a real estate photography business in 2019. Chris began studying at the College of Stoic Philosophers in 2011, where he completed the Stoic Essential Studies in 2012 and the Marcus Aurelius School in 2013. He's currently the scholarch of the college, but prior to this position, he sat on the New Stoa board and served as the Dean of Students. Chris is the author of the Traditional Stoicism blog, as I've mentioned, and the Stoicism on Fire podcast. And in 2016, Stoicism Today published Chris's defense of the traditional Stoic doctrine of providence in Stoicism Today, Selected Writings number 2. In 2019, he contributed a chapter about Stoicism in the book entitled Pandeism, an Anthology of the Creative Mind. Chris currently lives near Tampa, Florida, with his wife of 25 years and 2 of his 5 children who haven't yet flown from the nest. So from all of that, with all of that said, it's very clear that Chris is a very natural guest on our show and has such a wealth of experience and understanding about the real ancient traditional form of Stoicism that perhaps many of us do not get a lot of access to if we don't dive deep enough. And so this was a beautiful opportunity today. Now, just before we dive in, I have one more thing that I want to say, and I apologize, but we do have a couple of meetups coming up this week in the Walled Garden, absolutely free and available to everybody to attend. We'd love to see you there. So one is we're going to be speaking with Jonathan Church and Kai Whiting about Stoicism and free speech. That's coming up at the end of this week, and you can go to thewalledgarden.com/events, or if you just go to thewalledgarden.com, you can follow the links there. And then we also have our final Soul Searching with Seneca meetup for the month coming up this Sunday for us Australians, and probably Saturday evening for the rest of you. So we'd love to see you at those events. As I said, go to thewalledgarden.com/events, and there will be a link in the show notes as well. But with all of that said, I want to take up no more of your time with this introduction, and I just want to dive into this conversation. And so it's a pleasure to introduce you to Chris Fisher.
I'm really delighted to have the first guest I decided to invite on board this ship, Christopher Fisher. Chris was one of the few living, what I would call Stoics, that we actually mentioned him being better. He is literally one of the very few, if possibly the only one, who's outside of footnotes that is actually mentioned him being better. That was how much I enjoy his work. I enjoy his cultivation of character. He has really taught me a lot about tenacity and about standing firm for what you believe in. So please, Chris, can you introduce yourself? And then I've got some questions. So I won't grill you too much because it's not the idea of this particular question and answer session, but I really want to show other people, showcase your work, which is not something you're actually good at for some reason. I don't
know. Well, thanks. Chris Fisher. I'm with the College of Stoic Philosophers. I started studying Stoicism back in 2011 as a result of my experiences in law enforcement. Law enforcement led me to some pretty dark writings of Nietzsche, which led me to Jonathan Haidt, which led me to start to consider Stoicism. And Sharon, yours was one of the first books that I actually picked up back then, just so you know. And for anybody that's looking for, if you go into Barnes & Noble, every once in a while they have the small hardbound version of that for like $5. And every time I find them, I grab them all up because I give them out to people. It's a great little thing just to hand out to people, and a great introductory book. So kudos for that. I have the Traditional Stoicism blog and the Stoicism on Fire podcast. That's pretty much it.
Okay, so my first question to you, Chris, is because one of the things that I admire about you is that you have probably the most advanced study of Stoicism outside of the academic world of people that I know. So could you tell me why you feel that an advanced Stoicism is something that really does help you cultivate a character? And the second part of that question is why, after 3 years or 4 years, some of us in the community kind of feel safe with just learning about the dichotomy of control. And that is actually proliferated by certain contemporary authors who, despite having 2 or 3 books, really focus, for example, on the dichotomy of control, which is one sentence, as opposed to, for example, okiosis or something a bit more complex, which the ancient Stoics discussed at length. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Why you feel the need for an advanced study and why there's a reluctancy in the general Stoic contemporary circle not to push forward into that advanced study?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It, like anything else, you're going to get out of it what you put in. So, and some people, quite frankly, may be interested in Stoicism in the same way that they're interested in, learning the golden rule and the Beatitudes of Christianity, and limit it to that. In other words, some basic ethical principles that they can maybe apply to their life. Maybe some practices. You see a lot of that again in I would call it Western versions of Buddhism that touch on Buddhist principles, but don't really dive deep into it. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that's in many cases that's all they want out of it. So if that's all you want, there's maybe no reason to go any deeper. For me, for whatever reason, maybe I was in a deeper hole. I don't know. I needed to go deeper. I came to Stoicism, I think, as I've made pretty clear, as a pretty hardened atheist. I had been a Christian as a much younger man, walked away from that probably about 30 years ago and turned into a very hardcore atheist. And by the time I went to my second career in law enforcement as an atheist and started dealing with what I was exposed to on the street, I realized real quick, a couple of Nietzsche's famous sayings, which is one, when you're dealing with monsters, you have to be careful not to become a monster yourself. And two, when you look into the abyss, when you stare into the abyss also stares back. And law enforcement is one of those professions where you stare into the abyss daily, because you're seeing the absolute worst of humanity on a daily and hourly basis. So that's what brought me to Stoicism. And once I scratched the surface of it, for me, I needed to dig deeper. And digging deeper meant going to the College of Stoic Philosophers. When I went through the first program, the SES program, which good to see a couple of students on here that are from the program, and then decided to move on to the Marcus Aurelius program. Struggled through a portion of that because, as an atheist, and our educational programs at the college do not we don't coerce, we don't convince anybody to try to believe anything in particular. But what we do is we just present Stoicism as it is. So you're going to read about providence and God and Logos. You're going to read what the ancient Stoics believed. And, I came to a place where I almost walked away from Stoicism in the second term, because that's the physics term where you start to study theology. And I was having a real hard time getting my head around all of this stuff. I was still at the stage where, just the word God sent shivers down my spine. But I worked through that. I decided not to walk away, and finally understood what was really meant by the Stoics when they used those words. And it was not what I had been brought to. So with that leads into the second part of your question. I think part of what we have today is a lot of people in the Western world, and I guess I can only speak for the United States, who are, for the most part, ignorant of Stoicism, apart from stiff upper lip and suck it up buttercup type versions of Stoicism. That's what we've been taught. And so when modern Stoicism broke out in it really kind of went mainstream in 2015. You had a populace of people who really didn't know what this was, and so teaching it at the basic level, which is fine, but I think where the miscommunication sometimes is that people assume when they pick up a book like The Obstacle is the Way, that which is a fine book, but they're assuming they're getting Stoicism, not a very watered down principles of Stoicism. And so the difficult part for me as a blogger and as a podcaster is to break through that, to reach the people who have already read the books. And in some cases, these books are written by people with PhDs or 2 PhDs. And then here I come along. I don't have a PhD, and I'm saying, Stoicism is something different. You need to look a little deeper. And it's really difficult to get people to dive into the texts and into the scholarships themselves to realize there's more to it. And it's fine. Again, I'm not criticizing. I've never been a critic of modern Stoicism from the sense of saying that it is bad. In fact, I've encouraged the development of it, because I think what happens is the modern versions attract a lot more people. They attract people to a version of virtue ethics that, let's face it, if all we did was perpetuate those principles throughout the world would be a better place. So the issue that I personally have with modern Stoicism is not that; it's that it is sometimes marketed as the real deal. This is Stoicism, and it's even in Brad Inwood, his book in 2018, he rightfully labeled modern Stoicism as minimal Stoicism, which is tracing it back to its heritage, back to Aristo of Chios, not to Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, because Aristo was someone who left the Stoa early on, and because he really wanted to focus, if not exclusively, predominantly on nothing but the ethics. He really didn't see as much value in studying the logic and the physics that Zeno and Cleanthes and Chrysippus did. So he left the Stoa, started his own school, and his followers then were called or known as Aristotelians, not as Stoics, because he founded his own school. And in the same way that Zeno shows up at the Cynic school, studies with them, decides, there's a lot here that I like, and he took a lot with him. But then he goes and studies with the Megarians, likes their logic, studies at the academy, and then blends all this together into a unique systematic philosophy, but he didn't stand on a street corner and say, "Hey, I'm teaching Platonic, philosophy, or I'm teaching cynicism," because the cynics would have, tarred and feathered him at the time, because they knew that there was a distinction. So to me, I think there's words and traditions and histories have meaning and value. And I think there's value in understanding that Stoicism has particular meaning. And if moderns want to adapt it to whatever, you can adapt, it has been adapted to Christianity. That occurred, in the Neo-Stoics. So it was already adapted, and now it's being adapted to more an agnostic and atheistic version. That's great. Let's just be very upfront about how we're marketing it. Yeah, this is and Becker, as an example, Lawrence Becker, did a very good job of doing that in his book. He called it a new Stoicism and labeled it as such. So I think when you ask about educating people, I think you have two hurdles. The combination of the general populace really not knowing much about Stoicism because it has been such an ignored tradition for so long. And then you heap on top of that lack of knowledge some, and it's not misinformation. It's not like modern Stoics are out there trying to deceive people. That's not what I'm arguing. It's that they're putting it out there in a way that people perceive it as, okay, well, this is Stoicism. And it's just a different version of Stoicism.
Would you say, though, that there is something lost when one takes a cookie cutter approach where they take the bits they like? They go to the buffet, or, if you don't like the cookie cutter, and they take the little bit that they like, and they go to a slightly different buffet and they take a little bit more, and they end up with a plate with a mixture of all different of wisdom traditions. What do you lose? You do gain something by doing that because you learn a little bit about everything, and there are uses to that. But what do you lose when you either take a cookie cutter approach to Stoicism, or you just take the dichotomy of control, for example, and then you go on to your, in your conveyor belt and you take the next thing? What would you say you lose from the Stoics, from your life, when you take a very superficial, in my view, perspective of everything Stoicism may have to offer someone?
Yeah, it is. You lose the system. It was designed as a system. The ancient Stoics believed that the system was integrated in a way that it could not be disassembled. In fact, argued vehemently that it could not be disassembled, which is why they offered the three similes of the egg, the orchard, and the animal, and in discussing their physics, ethics, and logic, because in each one of those, it's an organism. It's not an artifact. They could have just as easily said, well, Stoicism is like a house with a floor and walls and a ceiling, or Stoicism is like a cart with a body, a tongue to pull it with, and wheels. But they didn't. They didn't choose artifacts. They chose organisms which could not have the parts removed and still have the organism exist as a whole. Whenever you break a system apart, I won't argue that it's better or worse, because it's quite possible that modern Stoics could find a version of Stoicism that 50 or 60 years from now we decide is better, more effective for moderns. So better or worse is not the argument I'll make. Vastly different is. So if you're going to break the system apart, you're changing the system, and so, as I've said numerous times on my podcast, your mileage may vary. You can't count on the promises of Stoicism. I've likened, I think in my discussion with you one time, Kai, we were talking about the approach to top of Mount Eudaimonia. Some have argued, well, it's not one mountain. On my Facebook group, somebody tried to argue, well, it's not one mountain, it's different mountains. Okay, well, it's a metaphor. It's not designed to be perfect. But if we consider, Mount Eudaimonia, and we're trying to get to the top of it, and at the base of Mount Eudaimonia, you walk up as a seeker, and you're saying, yeah, I want well-being. And you look over here, and you've got the cynic standing, and he said, okay, here's the path to the top of Eudaimonia. And you look at him, and he's barefoot, and he has a staff, and he says, follow me. And well, maybe I'm not prepared for that. And then you look over here and you see, the Peripatetics, and here's the real path to eudaimonia. And, they've got a backpack on, and they've got some pack mules to carry some extra goods with them. And a little farther down, you've got the Epicureans, and they're all, loaded up in a Mercedes-Benz 4-wheel drive, and they're going to head up the mountain. But the Stoics, it's a unique path. And it doesn't mean that any of those other paths can't get you to the top of Mount Eudaimonia, but here's the reality. Any one of us who says, well, we have arrived, or I will even say, I don't expect to arrive. I don't expect to reach sagehood in this lifetime. If I find that reincarnation is true and I get a couple dozen more lives, maybe, but I don't count on that in this lifetime. I count on advancing toward that goal. But if we believe the Stoics, and very few people are ever going to achieve that, well, then what is it that we are really doing? We're following a path. And if you change the path, and then you've changed the process. And the process is what changes the person. And again, going back to my original, my only argument against modern Stoicism is that's fine. Stand there and make the same argument with the seekers. But don't walk over, and this is where I think some of the modern Stoics have gone, and scratch out the sign that says Stoicism and put up a different sign that says modern Stoicism and say, no, this is the real path. Because that path over there still exists and it's still viable. And there are people like me who still want to follow that path. Now, with that said, Simon mentioned Seneca and his propensity to reach out and bring in other wisdom traditions. And I think it's fair to say that the Stoics would never have objected to that, Seneca aside. But again, one of the things that is I will say a trope in modern Stoicism is, well, Seneca said you can blaze your own trail. You're right. Blaze your own trail, but that's not a Stoic trail. That's your trail. That's a different trail. And the one thing that is true of Seneca was a great fan of Epicurus and quoted him often. And I think it rightly was willing to seek wisdom wherever he could find it. But what was also true of Seneca is that there is zero evidence that he ever contradicted any foundational or fundamental Stoic doctrine. He never denied that Stoic logic had no value. He never denied that the Stoic conception of the cosmos as providentially ordered was not true. He never did any of that. So we very quickly go down a path where we don't know where it leads when we start to do that. And I will say this again, the thing that I think we have to be careful of with modern Stoicism and any modern variant that we create is that some of the arguments that have been used to support the modern divergence from the traditional path. What are they? Well, one very popular argument that by one of the big proponents of modern Stoicism is, well, we only really have maybe 1% of the actual documents, the actual Stoic texts. 99% of them are lost to us. So who knows what was there? Okay, that's one argument. The other one is, Seneca said we could blaze our own trail. And then we also have, well, if Stoicism had evolved or continued to exist as a school, it would have evolved into, agnosticism. So let's address each of those at a time. If I say, well, there's only 99% are lost, we only have 1%. Well, what does that mean? Can we just make up the other 99%? Can we, do we just get to, well, I think, because what we've done is we've said, well, we've opened the door to some of the nonsense that we see. Now we've got, I just saw it the other day, we've got Hollywood Stoics. We have Hollywood Stoics. We have Silicon Valley Stoics. We have, apparently a group of Stoics that are using it to promote some version of a men's movement. I don't even know what's out there, but the point is that you open the door to that. The second you say, well, we don't really have to rely on the Stoic texts and the credible scholarship on the text, we get to make up whatever, we want and to make our own synthesis. Well, then how do you argue against those groups? How do you say, well, no, you're not a Stoic. That's not Stoicism. On what basis would you make that argument? Because you've already given up the texts and the scholarship. Again, I think I've already addressed Seneca, but I'll move on from that. I think I beat that horse to death. But if you have any further questions,
I think also
I'll answer them.
like Seneca says, you can blaze your own path once you understand the foundations of Stoicism. Like if you literally read the sentence before, it's clear that he's not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater. He is clearly saying like once you've done, for example, the College of Stoic Philosophers, right? Once you've done that, and then you say, for example, I want to add something to Stoicism based on the principle. So Leah and I added the circle of concern, the environment, based on a logocentric perspective. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't that we did that because we felt that, you know what's missing in Stoicism, environmental ethics. It wasn't. It was like, what can Stoicism provide to environmental ethics? What are the roots that we have that we can grow into something new, but not based on something we've grafted in? Rather, it was already there. The ideas are there, the concepts are there, but they haven't been applied to environmental issues. So they haven't been applied to, let's say, artificial intelligence, or they haven't been applied to immigration or climate breakdown, which is what Being Better is. It's a book that looks at what does Stoics have to say, or what would a contemporary Stoic or somebody influenced by them say about issues that they didn't really deal with because they were dealing with other issues. But it wasn't a case of like, we're like, you know what, let's just blaze our own path. I think you probably said I'm one of the more traditional Stoics that you can meet, particularly in the academic sphere. So I do smile when people say, he says you can blaze your own path. No, he didn't. He said they're our guides, not our masters, but guides means that you have a structure, right? It means you have a framework within which you operate, because that's what a guide does. A guide might say, you go here, you go there, you go there. It doesn't mean I have to follow you every step of the way, but I can't go off the path and then complain, like you've just pointed out. But the Silicon Valley Stoics are doing this, and that's not really Stoicism, because as you rightly say, if you throw out the guidebook, how can you defend that? Because you're saying that they shouldn't have their own guidebook when you've said, but let's create our own. So I think you're absolutely right. I just wanted to just switch gears a little bit, because at the Walled Garden, we have just about launched, or we're about to launch, some mentoring and some coaching linked to traditional Stoicism, because we do feel that it's fine to have modern Stoic mentors. We just don't feel that there's enough in the traditional Stoic sense, where people can come to us and advance their own journey on a one-to-one basis. But I think the best kept secret in the Stoic movement is actually the College of Stoic Philosophers. I think you guys have literally a gold mine of information that very few people know about. And I honestly believe that contemporary Stoic movement, so I'm not saying either modern or traditional, just the contemporary Stoic movement in general, would be better off if more people came through your doors. Simply because I can tell by the quality of the conversations I have with your students on Facebook and elsewhere, you can tell when somebody really understands Stoicism by the quality of the question. And I've never, ever had somebody who's come through your doors ask me a question that isn't very, very sensible, in the sense of they really understand Stoicism, whereas perhaps if they've read a quote unquote Stoic text, or at least a Stoic influence text, I can tell what they've read by the question. So could you please tell everybody a little bit more about the college? Because, I really, really enjoy it. I think it's wonderful. I just think nobody really knows enough about it. Would you mind doing that, Chris, for me?
Yeah. The college was founded in 2008 by my mentor and the former scholar of the college, Eric Weigart. And at the time, there was nothing like it. It was actually, that would have been maybe 4 to 5 years before even anybody had an idea of anything called modern Stoicism, before the modern Stoicism movement, even almost a decade before it, actually 7 or 8 years before it got started. But he started the college with the idea of training Stoic philosophers. The college sticks strictly to the texts and to top-notch scholarship. So in the SES program, as an example, I know we had veered away from the book a little bit, but now we're back using John Sellers' book, Stoicism. So, Sellers is a recognized scholar. And so we have 3 schools. The first is a prep school. It's for 14 to 18-year-olds. We created that because we had a number of people that were applying to the college, but were still in school. And our position was the SES program was really designed for working adults, people who were out in the world and had a little bit of life experience. So the unless there's an exception made, you can't get into the SES program unless you're 18 years old or over. It's a 4-month program. It is mentored, which means you are assigned to an individual mentor, and you work through each of the topics: logic and physics and ethics. And actually, the first lesson is on some history, so you get a little bit of history of the Stoa. And again, it's all based upon scholarship and the text. Now, when you get into the Marcus Aurelius program, that's a whole nother level. That's a year-long program, and that's very intense. So you're going to read just about cover to cover the Cambridge Handbook on Stoicism. You're going to read a couple of books by Pierre Hadot. You're going to read Anthony Long's book on Hellenistic philosophy to give you some context in the Hellenistic world, differentiation between the skeptics and the cynics and the Stoics. And one of the things that I'm bringing back into the program now that I'm in charge of the school is it's an introduction to quantum physics. That was there when I went through the program, and we had some students struggling with it, so we set it aside. But we're bringing that back in with some material now. Don't be dissuaded. You're not. I don't understand the math of quantum physics. I don't understand quantum. But the idea, what we're trying to do, is to get you to realize that the modern mechanistic, reductive, materialistic view of the world is over a century outdated. There is a whole nother paradigm that exists, which the modern scientific world really hasn't even fully adopted, and that is quantum theory. And what you see now is a kind of a paradigm shift in even amongst some top-notch thinkers, where quantum theory combined with some consciousness studies are bringing about an unfolding field called panpsychism, which I won't make the argument that Stoics were panpsychists, but I will make the argument that panpsychism is one giant step toward a Stoic conception of the cosmos and of consciousness. So that program, again, is a year long. It's 4 terms. And then we just recently implemented a 5th term for those graduates from the school who decide that they want to go on and become a mentor themselves. So that's basically an internship. And you'll take on a couple of SES students and mentor them through the program. And then you will become a member of the faculty at the college. What is unique about our college is that everyone in the school it's a homegrown faculty. We don't have anybody that's mentoring at the college that hasn't been through the program themselves. So on the one hand, yes, we are a well-kept secret. On the other hand, there's a reason for that. And quite frankly, we just haven't had the bandwidth to be able to take on more students. And we're still right now, a combination of the, you're helping to promote it, people hearing about it on the podcast. We're struggling to keep up with the number of students that are starting to apply. So that's a good problem to have to solve. But it's a wonderful program, and I strongly encourage anybody to look at least the SES program, because you'll come out of the SES program, number one, with a solid basic understanding of Stoicism, and you'll be able to when you get on Facebook and people start talking about eudaimonia and the other concepts that are oikiosis that you may not be familiar with, you will know what they're talking about. When we start talking about pneuma and logos and even provenance, you'll realize, okay, these are not the trigger words that I need to be concerned about for monotheism. These are words that the Stoics used and had a particular meaning. Yes, it is spiritual. Yes, it does refer to a god of sorts, but it's not the God that most of us learned about in Sunday school and may have an aversion to. So, but wonderful program.
If I was going to play devil's advocate, because I do love the college. If I were to say, oh, but what about the practical use of it? Like, you're going to teach me a lot of the Stoic theory, but how would my life change in a practical way? What kind of feedback have your students given you in that?
Well, part of both programs is application. So at the SES level, we will give some practical problems, and they're not problems that there's an answer to, because the answer is really going to be, as I said in my most recent podcast, Stoicism doesn't provide us with a book of rules. It provides us with a set of principles that we then apply to our lives. And the way I apply those principles in my life under my circumstances might be slightly different than the next person. And in fact, the way I apply them on Monday might be slightly different than the way I apply them on Friday, because the context is different. And that's different from what a lot of people get in religions, where there's these strict rules. You know, you never do this, you always do that. Again, it doesn't make it subjective. It just means that you're operating within and applying those principles. So, and then in the Marcus Aurelius school, the first three terms are logic, physics, logic, physics, physics and ethics. But the fourth term is a term we call prosoche. And that is an entire term of doing nothing but writing and finding personal applications in your life. And in fact, one of the things you'll be required to do is to pick a project in that term. It could be a writing project. If anybody has read my paper on prosoche, I wrote that during my fourth term at Marcus Aurelius School. That was my fourth term project, to understand the concept of prosoche, of paying attention, which a lot of people, to some degree, mistakenly attribute to mindfulness. It's similar to mindfulness in a lot of ways, but still, I think, different enough that we shouldn't just label it mindfulness. But so there, that is an application aspect of it. It's not just theory.
Okay, I'm looking forward to one day teaching with Leo a little bit on a session of the quality of moral errors, because that's the only thing in Stoic theory that I feel doesn't get enough ink. So I look forward to one day jumping on that bandwagon a little bit more and just giving some guest lectures if I were able to. But that's just me being naughty,
yes,
so you don't have to answer that. I just want to, my last question before I open it up to everybody is, could you recommend 3 introductory books that you think would give a solid grounding to the kind of thing that that your students would see once they come through your doors? Because a lot of people tell me things like, you should read this book, which tends to have me hitting my head against the wall, and to the point I think I really need to move my head. Right? What are the 2 or 3 introductory books you would say give you a solid grasp rather than perhaps confuse you when they come through your door? Because I imagine there are a few books that would strike as not very helpful, let's put it like that, if you were to pursue a more rigorous Stoic study, as you will in the college.
Yeah, and I guess I would approach that from 2 different angles. If it's somebody that just doesn't know anything about Stoicism and is not even sure that they're interested in pursuing it at all, then I would certainly recommend your book and David Feidler's book, both for 2 reasons. Both books for the same kind of reason, is that they're subtle in their approach. You're not getting beat over the head with theory, but you're grasping concepts as you go through, maybe even unknowingly. These concepts are being laid out in the book in a way that that don't require someone to memorize or understand any Greek terminology or anything like that. So both of those books are very helpful. Sharon's book also, in terms of just introducing someone to, if you've got a friend that, hey, I heard about this thing called Stoicism, what is it? Any one of those books would be good for that. If we're asking, okay, this is someone who is interested in Stoicism, they've read a book and now they want to learn a little bit more, then get a hold of Hellenistic Philosophy by, in fact, coincidentally, I have it right here, Anthony Long. This book, the chapter, although it's on 3 philosophies, half the book is on Stoicism. Stoicism starts on page 110. So it's over half the book is just on Stoicism. And that provides just an outstanding theoretical introduction to Stoicism. The other book that, so if you really want to get, immersed in kind of the spiritual / philosophical depth of Stoicism, read Pierre Hadot's The Inner Citadel. Pierre Hadot's, it's a book that is, if you read it properly, it's going to take you some time to get through it, because there's just a lot to chew on in the book. But he won't ever lead you astray in terms of teaching you something that is contrary to what the Stoics themselves taught. And it would be a very great, basically anything by Anthony Long. The only reason I hesitate at all with Anthony Long is that he's very academic. So unless you're willing to put in the time, you might struggle with that. Pierre Hadot and Pierre Hadot's other book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, also has a lot of material on Stoicism, which I think anybody who's interested in really embarking on a Stoicism as a practice, as a way of life, will get a lot out of. If you go out to, in fact, right now they just put it up, but at the College of Stoic Philosophers, which is just collegeofstoicphilosophers.org, you'll see the Scholar's recommended reading list, and all of those books are out there in a reading list, so anybody can have access to it. They're just the recommended books for someone who is interested in, what has affectionately become known to me, at least, as traditional Stoicism, or whatever you want to call it, Orthodox Stoicism. Large Stoicism is the term that Brad Inwood called it, which means the all-inclusive, systematic, holistic version of Stoicism.
Thank you. I certainly understand what you say about A.A. Long. When I read a chapter, I have to read it again. Like, I get it and go, right, I've only got half the notes that I need. And when I'm on a phone call with him, I ask him a question, and I know that he'll give me the answer, and I'll still be thinking about it like 2 days later. So I know exactly what you mean when you just ask a question. You're like, I'm sure there were like 3 levels of that conversation. I'm pretty sure that I didn't get it the first time, right? So he is an absolute marvelous academic, absolute. And I really recommend, if you have a chance to listen to the StoicCon 2018 speech by A.A. Long, which is very accessible, actually. I would thoroughly recommend it because it will give you a very concise understanding of the kind of scholar that he is. I think that's the kindest way to put it, because he is excellent. But I would say that A.A. Long or Anthony Long is not necessarily the most accessible scholar. For that, I would probably pick someone more like William Stevens, although he hasn't got the breadth of the scholarly material. But yes, absolutely. A.A. Long, fantastic. Thank you, Chris.
You've been listening to the Walled Garden podcast. If you'd like to attend any of our free meetups and events, or if you'd like to get one-on-one mentoring with either Sharon LaBelle, Kai Whiting, or myself, just go to thewalledgarden.com. But for now, don't forget to nourish those gardens in your mind.